Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Her Faith Inspires podcast, where we address cultural issues through the lens of scripture. Today, I have a father-son duo on the show, and we're going to talk about a helpful resource that you'll want to add to your family library. Let me tell you a little bit about them before I bring them on. J. Warner Wallace is a Dateline featured cold case detective, a speaker, a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and adjunct professor of apologetics at Talbot School of Theology, which is Biola University, Gateway Seminary, and Southern Evangelical Seminary. Jimmy Wallace has over a decade of law enforcement experience and a master's degree in applied apologetics from Colorado Christian University. Jimmy lives in Southern California with his wife, daughter, and much too large comic book collection. Jim and Jimmy, welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad you guys are here.
Well, it's funny you should say that about the comic book collection, because I think that it looks really cool behind Jimmy that he's got what look like case files. And,
Yes.
and and sometimes case files end up in in boxes that are similar to that. But no, those are not case files. Those are just the ridiculous number of thousands of comic books that Jimmy owns. They're
Really?
alphabetized, organized by type. Yeah, it's he's very serious about that. So
Oh, that
The
is
first
cool.
thing
When
you
did you
got to
get into
do,
those?
the first thing you got to do when you go on a Christian podcast is show all your material possessions that you just hold like so tightly. All the
yeah,
money,
exactly.
material possessions. Yeah,
Yeah, you
Yeah.
idolater, you. But look at you can see the labels on the. I just noticed the labels on the boxes. I know what those
they're
are.
actually not correct. Don't look at them too closely. I got to update them.
Did you
I'm a
read
little
all
bit
of those? Have
behind.
you read all of them?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
see, now
I,
that's the impressive thing. Sometimes
I would
people
say
just collect them. They don't read them all.
there's a lot of pictures.
yeah,
To be
yeah,
fair.
not that hard. Yeah. Well, here's the other thing too, is that you know how this is. Like you and I have read a lot before we ever decided we were going to pen something, right? So to write, like to do curriculum, is impossible unless you're a good reader, and then you're also looking at other curriculum to write a book. Unless you, so I just knew that there's no way I could do a graphic novel. I
Mm.
don't even understand the way we're going to organize. I can help you with the storyline, and we can talk about the apologetics approach we're going to take. But when it comes right down to like how are we going to write this, like this is if you saw the script that Jimmy had to write to get this thing done, it's weird. It feels like it's a screenplay, where you have to describe here are the
Yeah.
characters in the scene, here's the dialogue, here's the narrative of the scene, this is how many panels it's going to be. This is on one page. Oh my gosh. I think that's why I'm glad he is a reader like this, because there's no way you're going to strike out with the first effort
Mm.
and have it be any value at all unless you're just consumed by comics the way he has been most of his life.
Yeah.
So.
I actually love to, I always say that I like to get into like the backstory, what got you guys going here. And I do want to ask that because I was looking through the graphic novel and I can see that you even use different colors. Like it looks like like when you're narrating it, it's in yellow or something. And when it's like more of the dialogue of the story or something, it's in white. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how you get like the visual learner to be able to keep up with where you are. But I want you to tell me about that in a minute. First of all, I want to know about like Jimmy, you followed in your dad's footsteps. We've already said you don't look like him, but you did like you do like imitate him, right? So well, I don't know if imitate him is the right word, but you went into law enforcement. By the way, my dad and my brother were the same. They were in Fresno, California, law enforcement there, motorcycle police officers. But you also have a background in Christian apologetics, which I think is really cool because if you want to talk about a police officer that is like above the other ones, like above all other, like you can really get in there and on the crime scene, you could give them like, the case for Christianity at the same time. I just find that to be so fascinating that you got the Christian apologetics background as well. So you did follow your dad in like every way, right? But Jim is known as the cold case Christianity guy and the most featured guy on like Dateline NBC. And now you both wrote this graphic novel together, which is also encouraging. I have three boys, and I always think, wow, if they were involved in my work that I do one day, what a answered prayer, what showing the faithfulness of God, in my opinion. So what I want to know is, as you're growing up and you're in, law enforcement and you're doing apologetics, when did this idea of like, Dad, let's do this graphic novel on worldview? how, when, why, like what was the conversation that led to this project?
Oh man, okay. It's probably like a lifetime coming, but we didn't see it that way. It was
Yeah.
definitely not my I never thought that we would actually get into making comic books, but I always loved comic books. So that was something I always did. My dad is it's partly his fault because every month we would go get our haircuts, me and my brother. And his big thing was across the street from the haircut place, from the barbershop, was a little comic store. And they had a bin of old comics that you could get for a quarter. So he gave us a
Mm.
dollar each, and we could get four comics for that month. And that was a big thing of us growing up reading comic books. And so I always loved the comic side. And then, of course, having J. Warner Wallace as your dad meant that there was a lot of dinners with him and his friends arguing over Calvinism or some other area of theology. And so, as a like 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, I'm just trying to eat up all this apologetics and theology and stuff. So I think as I was growing up, comics, apologetics, theology, this was all just sort of like a part of my daily life. But way later, after I became a police officer, I don't even know how long I'd been working. I decided to try to go back and get a master's degree in apologetics because I wanted to get more into an apologetics ministry. And it was my dad's encouragement that, hey, go get some formal training so you really actually know what you're talking about
Mm.
before you get too deep into ministry. And right as I was graduating from that program, we had heard that David C. Cook, a Christian publisher my dad had previously worked with, had purchased a comic book company, a small independent publisher of comics. And so the stars were essentially aligning. Actually, my degrees in applied apologetics. So the idea was to learn apologetics and then also with the emphasis on how are we going to now use this in a practical way
Mm.
in ministry. So I guess it was, in retrospect, I can see God working through that, kind of lining everything up. Now I'm somewhat credentialed to do this. I've got the reading experience, at least, if not writing experience. And hey, there's a publisher that has bought a comic book company but doesn't have material to produce yet. They just want to get into the graphic novel space. And so we were able to reach out and just God lined it all up where we were able to do this project.
Wow. I'm glad that we're not the only ones that argue with friends about Calvinism. We had this discussion a couple months ago. My
Well,
boys are like 21 and 19, and they could not wait. We put a list of topics on, this sheet of paper, and they were like, we were chomping at the bit to talk about Calvinism. So,
Some of my earliest
anyways,
memories about faith or about, as I'm learning, what is this thing? We're just starting to go to church as I'm listening to my dad and his close friends who are all Christians talking about, well, what is the exact nature of grace? Where's, God's will and our will? How does that work together? And I don't know if they even had like strong opinions, each of them, or if they were kind of wrestling through this together as they learned their own faith. But as a kid, I like ate that up. I loved that stuff, and I've
wow.
continued to love that to this day. And so hopefully it's represented in some way in this graphic novel we're doing.
I'm
well,
sure
and
it
you know
will
what's
be.
interesting about that too is that we do. It's like Jimmy and I are the same, cut from the same cloth. So we just we agree on most all the essentials. Of course, we agree on. But when it comes to the non-essentials of the faith, these are things that we are still wrestling through with each other. And so we will spend he has to drive home from Los Angeles County to where we live, and it's a little bit of a drive. So if he's on the way home, I love it when he calls me and he just tells me what is it that what position is he studying in right now, and we don't really argue about it as much as it was the same kind of conversations I was having as a very new believer
Mm.
with people who I had met in the church. So now I'm surrounding myself with people who are Christians for the first time ever, and they're coming over to my house and we're hashing through these issues that, to be honest, I was shocked that they hadn't examined deeply. You know how this works. I mean, we are interested in like learning. I'm 35 years old. Jimmy was probably 8 when I first got saved. And so we were trying to figure out, like what is this all about? And so he got to learn it as I was struggling through it. I think that's what made it interesting to him because I didn't have a lot of answers. I was just trying to get to the answers. So a lot of those conversations I was having with Christians who I thought had answers. Now, this is why we're writing these books, right? Because we've
Mhm, mhm.
discovered, of course, that even if you're a Christian, you may not have deeply thought about why it is you believe this is true. And we're hoping to produce resources that get you thinking. And that's what I think this book really is. It's just a way to kind of get you thinking in an entirely new approach. Now, you and I have talked about this a little bit, Chandra. I'm kind of concerned too that we know this is a gritty book. This is a real world book. And we do think that the Christian worldview, if it's true, we have to show people that it works, that it makes sense of even a messy world, not just a Pollyannish version. And you see a lot of Christian dramas in Christian movies that examine, the hardness of life. But in the end, everyone's going to get saved at the end and it's all going to have a happy ending. And this isn't always true in murder investigations. It's just not the reality of it. So
Yeah.
we wanted to show the truth of these kinds of things. And so there are times when this is a graphic novel that's graphic, but
Yeah.
it's no more graphic than anything you would see on legacy TV in the 8 or 9 o'clock hour in a murder mystery or a series about detectives. So it's not like this is, is advancing the ball in terms of graphic nature,
Right.
but it is something that it's not a comic book for the age that Jimmy first started reading comic books. But I bet you if you're in junior high or high school, especially
Mhm.
depending on who you are, you've already seen this stuff on TV or on streaming on Netflix. So now the question is,
Yeah.
where is God in this? That's what we're trying to address here.
Well, as a mom of three boys and as a teacher, because I teach middle schoolers apologetics, right now we're in the middle of a worldview course with online Christian courses. And I can tell you the boys in that class and the boys in this house would be all over this. And I was looking through it. It's very well done. I love, like, to me, it speaks to the visual learner because you're putting concepts in there. You're threading this idea of, answering this question of purpose and meaning, which is one of those worldview questions, but you're doing it through a way that attracts a certain type of audience, like I would say a younger audience, but I also say even adults, because there are, well, as Jimmy can attest, there's adults who love, the style of literature. So what I was looking through it now, I have a question that's I think it's kind of a silly question, but you may not think the Murph guy looks completely like unhappy. He looks like that came across loud and clear. I'm like, this guy is miserable. Do you guys know this guy personally, or is this just somebody that you like? I'm wondering if Murph is out there like, oh shoot, they wrote this book about me.
No, he's well, okay. So um, I don't know, Jimmy, if you know somebody, I would say that all of these characters are compilations of people we've worked with
Okay.
or we know them personally. Now, I'll bet you, because you'll see this is a group of detectives where almost everyone's Jimmy's age except for Murph.
Mm.
Now, that's not an accident because Jimmy's writing this book and I'm helping him just kind of chart the course of it. I'll just tell you, this is Jimmy Wallace and J. Warner Wallace in that order for a reason. Like I'm just helping Jimmy kind of think through like what could we do? What are the possibilities here? What's the overarching trajectory of the story? But then all the details, all the conversations, this is all out of the mind of Jimmy Wallace. And so I noticed that what makes it come alive for me is that the conversations between the characters and people who have reviewed the book, who have like listened to they think this is the best thing about it. It's the language, it's the conversations back and forth because they feel to me very contemporary. But Murph is a character right out of my generation, and that's why we made him the oldest character. He's already at retirement age or really close to it, and he's ready to go. And yeah, I think what happens is, and we've seen it 1,000 times, that the job does something to you, and you end up like this. This is who you end up, the glass half empty version of who you were when you started. And so there's a sense in which there is sadly often a trajectory. Now you tell me, Jimmy, if that's true, if you've seen that even in your career, because you've been on the job, you're halfway through your career. So you've seen it yourself. Don't you think that's what happens to people when they do the job long enough?
Yeah, I think there's Murph is not one person in particular, like a real person. We just changed their name. Like it's not this story is not a true story in that sense, but I think there's a lot of Murphs out there. This is a type of very common police officer. I remember when I was showing one of the early pages to one of my partners as we were kind of going through the process of making this book, and he first time he saw Murph, he's like, that is a cop. That guy, you can see he's carrying a bag because he's probably divorced and he's living at the station and he's listing all these things that he assumes about this character, but they're all based on things that we saw from people in our own agency, friends of ours at other police departments. There is something, that it's a common trope in law enforcement crime dramas that there's some grizzled detective who's unhappy and grumpy all the time, but the reason that's a trope is because it's very true. That's pretty common. I wouldn't say every cop is like that, but there's a lot of cops that are like that. And we wanted all the characters to feel real, even though they're not one particular person that we're thinking of that we knew in our career. We wanted them to all be types of cops that we'd worked with, so that if you were involved in law enforcement, if you were a police officer, or you knew a police officer, one of those characters, you'd go, oh yeah, I recognize that character as being so and so in my life.
Mm.
Yeah, I'll tell you something too that's interesting about that is that so I always channel one guy when I'm channeling a Murph type character. And he just passed away in the last couple of months. And he's a little older than me. He's kind of splits the generation between me and my dad, Jimmy's grandfather. And he was kind of in that generation of cops, maybe about 10 or 15 years ahead of me. And he, I loved this guy. I loved him. By the way, people like this, like Murph, are really quite lovable to work with. They're so much fun to work with, but they are in some ways damaged goods, right? They've had an experience. This is happening right now, by the way, just on an aside. I meet a lot of officers. We do a lot of counseling. Jimmy's mom, Susie, and I do a lot of counseling with officers that are about Jimmy's age. And they are in situations where they've been critically injured. And now they send them up to a Billy Graham Association event that we get the chaplain all summer long. And so we're dealing with 24 couples that are going to come up and their marriages are sideways because they're involved in a critical incident that has injured them deeply. And what I see is that in the generation that Jimmy's in, that there's people who have worked both pre and post George Floyd and all the riots and all the pushback on police officers. There's a whole generation of cops that are coming up that really only Jimmy is going to understand because they're going through something that, although we all experienced some pushback in our generation of law enforcement, we had a special event that happened that changed the way. And then after it, we had a number of district attorneys that were elected into office that pushed an agenda that was anti-police. These are district attorneys who used to be the people we would partner with to make cases. They were suddenly making cases on us, whether they were warranted or not. And so we really see now a whole generation of cops. So I think what you get in this book is some realism that you won't have in other dramas that are written by, often detectives will consult, but they're not the primary writer. Here, detectives are both consulting and are the primary writer. So I think you get a sense of realism in the book. I hope. But here's the most important thing. Look, we're not writing a book. Yes, it's entertaining. I hope it stands on its own as a detective novel. At the same time, we're here for a purpose. We're here to talk about the Christian worldview, and that's what we're trying to do: is get to some small aspect of the Christian worldview and make it real to the reader.
That's what I was going to ask you. So what is like when you're looking at case files, what's the storyline? What do you hope to convey besides the fact that it's a graphic novel and there's a story? What is the purpose of it?
I'll let Jimmy go ahead and take it.
Yeah, I think one of the things so I've been a Christian my entire time that I've been in law enforcement. And so the kind of Christian worldview questions were always in the back of my mind, even as I'm going through my basic training and stuff. And one of the things I noticed early on when I was in the academy and working patrol is that the value of human life was very important to me on a practical level as a police officer. There was all these rules I was supposed to follow. I'm still supposed to follow. For example, I can't just as a police officer just show up to your house and walk in. You have a Fourth Amendment protection that protects your privacy. I can't just let myself into your house. But if I walked by your house and I heard you screaming out of the window, "Oh my God, he's killing me," I can now go and kick your door open and run in there if I think I'm going to save your life, because the value of human life is so important. It supersedes all our other concerns. So that concern about your privacy and all the laws that protect you and would stop me from doing that, we put those aside because the value of human life is so important. So I realized that all the police officers I was working with, we all understood that human life was the most important, most valuable thing that we had, and our job was all centered around protecting it. But most cops could not ground or even understand why human life is valuable. They just assume it, and that's good. I mean, human life is valuable, but it's just an assumption. And Christianity helps us to, for me as a Christian, I knew how I could ground. Why do I think human life is valuable? It's because God created us. God has placed value in us. He has a value for us. So I just always had in the back of my mind. And so when we got to this point where, hey, we wanted to talk about a police story, one of the things that I knew really went good on the apologetic side, because there's great apologetic arguments that would say, if human life has value, therefore there must be a God. There's an argument to be made there apologetically. And because this has a practical function in law enforcement, I thought, man, these just seem like natural things that could go together. And so we've talked about a few different kind of angles for the first story. But this one was just the one that kind of seemed like the most natural fit. So the point of our story here is, does human life have value? The point of the story was to get our all our characters to question this. Does life have value? What gives it value? And where can we ultimately ground that in a way that it's not arbitrary or it can't lose value?
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
what's good about it too is Jimmy's done a good job in the kind of sketching of the story and then how we play it out to hint and hat tip at things that we think have value. So we want to start to get in it. There are kind of little hidden things in the subtext here that'll help you to start to realize, hey, yeah, this is an important issue, and how we ground it matters. How I always say it is, you notice that like today in America, there are going to be a large number of homicides that occur, and they are not going to make the national media. As a matter of fact, they may not even make the local media. Yeah, they're going to occur, even in Los Angeles County. There's likely to be a homicide today, and who's going to hear about it? Well, why? If a certain person gets killed, a certain kind of person gets killed, you might hear about it. It might even become a national headline. But why is that the case? Why do we give more value to some and less value to others? And is that really the way we should be treating all of these?
Mm.
And so that's what our storyline kind of starts to kind of to examine that issue. It's a part of a serial killer who's coming out, and he starts with what might be considered by the culture, at least,
Mm-hmm.
with somebody who doesn't have the same amount of value, and then he increases his target range so that the next killing involves somebody of slightly more cultural quote unquote value.
Mm-hmm.
Now we would say as Christians, these people, is that true? Are some people more value? Like as a detective, should I be more excited about working some murders than others?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and by the way, that's happening all over America.
Mm-hmm.
The news are reporting it, and we as humans are hat tipping that idea because we don't often care. Why don't we care? Well, it's because we have a misplaced idea about what gives a person value to begin with.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to examine that. Why? Because I think it begins a conversation about how you properly ground this. And that's why the book is called Murder and Meaning. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you ground value? And by the way, a value is one of those things that is about purpose and meaning in life. And we all are going to struggle with our own value, with our own identity.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who are we and where do we place our identity? So there's lots of issues you could explore here. Again, but is that like the gospel? No. And here's what I think is going to be interesting about this book. And Jimmy did this intentionally. You could read this book 75% of the way through and not even realize it's a Christian graphic novel. We want it to work on its own level. The main characters are not Christians. And this is going to end in a way that I think respects the reality of probably your experience in your job where you're around a lot of non-Christians and
Mm-hmm.
you'd like them all to eventually bend their knee to Jesus. But you know the project's a little more demanding than that. So this is a very realistic story in that sense.
Yeah. What you guys are really very close to this because you created it. For me being so far removed, I'm just hearing about it and looking through the book. I don't know that I can say that this is such a great angle for I always think of it as who I work with, right? I work with parents, I work with families, I work with middle school and high school kids. I'm a mom of around that age. There's not a lot out there for these age groups that's not already. I feel like it's either so basic and simple that it doesn't intellectually challenge the kids, or you get collegiate level apologetics, right? Where it's like, whoa, my brain hurts because I can't understand those terms. There's nothing that can help pull the reader to levels of understanding where they can grow from there. And I just see this as such a genius way to convey this message for, I also look at like when I write for a more at a level that people like the average person can understand. Because I think of myself before I ever heard the word apologetics, right? Before I got into it and started learning all the fancy terms and the things that I'm like, okay, I don't know that the average Christian has to know that stuff. So I like to write towards the average Christian, I guess you can say, who's just like, hey, I need to be able to survive in this crazy world that we're living in. And I appreciate work like this. I also don't think that people understand what goes into it. Like when I write with Frank, I write first and I go through everything and then I send it off to him. He edits and he adds. I'm curious though, because and Frank and I will sometimes email like, "Hey, look at this, Frank," or "I don't know about that. How should I word it?" But you guys have like you're probably I would assume, talking more. What did that look like over these? Because it took you a while to write this, right? And how did you guys collaborate on the project itself?
Well, I think part of it is you have to have great trust. That's why, and your relationship with Frank Turek and mine is deep enough that I trust Frank to tell me that, yeah, this is probably not a good approach to take because he's got more experience than I do. I don't even see myself as a Christian apologist. Now, am I in the world of Christian apologetics? Yeah, but that wasn't my goal. And I had an entirely robust career. I'm a retired detective who happened to become a Christian, and I can tell you how my job fed into that. So Jimmy's the same way. So I trust Jimmy so much in terms of like fleshing out the details that all I really have to do is make sure that we're on the same page in terms of the overarching story.
Mm.
So my involvement typically is going to be in that first couple of days or weeks where we're really trying to figure out like what is the apologetic content of this, what could we explore, but then how the relationships and the dialogue. I may read it and have a question about like why are we saying this, but then Jimmy will explain to me why we're saying this. And to be honest, I think he gets the right of final decision making on this because I trust him. I trust him in this genre, especially.
Hmm.
So if we were just doing a strict apologetics book, I think it'd be a little bit different. I'll give you an example of this. Sean McDowell and I wrote a book called So the Next Generation Will Know. And how we wrote that book is that Sean would write one chapter and allow me to insert any personal experience that I had into that chapter. I would write a chapter, do the exact same thing in reverse. And we told each other, you can also edit the chapter. I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to trust your edit. And then at the very end, we gave it to a third person, my wife, who became the final editor to kind of make sure the voices sounded like one voice.
Mm.
Well, that's not how this worked. I
Mm.
just worked with Jimmy on the overarching story. And then Jimmy made the characters come to life. Picked the names for the characters, just made them all come to life. And that's why I think it doesn't feel like a collaborative effort, probably. It probably just feels like one author because it is. It's just that I just helped him kind of chart the general course
Mm.
and then also make sure that, hey, are we trying too hard here? Jimmy always has great questions, and then I kind of will just answer whatever. If he's not going to ask me a question, though, I don't need to get involved.
Mhm.
But this is because, number one, we think alike, and we've already hashed through all the issues together on the phone, probably. And
Yeah.
so I just trust him to make those things come real. I don't know what you thought about your experience with it, Jimmy.
I think he's giving me way too much credit. I like to, say that this is all me, like he's trying to say, but I don't know if that's really the reality. But that's typical for him. He's always trying to give me more credit than I'm supposed to have over here. He's gonna give me a big head. I'm trying to stay humble over here. What when in the early days of this, what we did was we came at this with I created 6 very broad characters who
Mm.
ultimately are in the book, but we revised them over time. But the idea was we're talking about types, so I want to get 6 people who have some variety, but also will feel like each one of these were probably multiple people that we'd worked with in our careers, or we heard even my grandfather's a cop stories from his career. We want something that feels real. And my dad came up with 6 plots for potential stories, and we whittled those, and a villain. Um, and we whittled those 6 plots into essentially, we kind of combined them, went back and forth, and we came up with 2. And those are the 2 ideas that we pitched, this story being one of them. So the basic plot and the villain were, I'm going to pass the buck back over to him and say, no, that was more him than me. But really, we went back and forth. So then we had these basic plots. And typically, I would try to come up with an outline, send it to him. He would go back and forth, get a little bit more of an outline, and go back and it was very revision heavy. And so I think there's plenty of lines here where I would not even remember it anymore who wrote a particular line of dialogue or narration or made a certain story decision. So I would probably say it's a little bit more collaborative than that. But also, I want to make sure that before we go too far, we at least give some credit where credit's due to our artists, because we
Yeah.
only did the story portion of this. There's 2 artists. Well, there's 2 main artists who dealt with this here, Steve Crespo and Dario Farmasani. They really carry the bulk of the work. I mean, if you think about it, so my dad talked earlier about the comic book script being like a screenplay. If that's the case, the artist ends up being every actor, the director, the costume designer, the set designer, the light doing the lighting. A lot of the stuff is carried by the art. So as excited as I am that we got to write this story, and I love comics, so I'm geeking out that I get to write one. I want to make sure we're giving credit where credit's due. If you read this and something hits you and there's a certain emotion that you take away, like you were talking about, that Murph seems like an unhappy guy. That's all we want to give that credit to our artists who really were able to
That's right.
convey the emotion. And there's a lot of narration and dialogue, but so much is said through the nonverbal cues of an actor, or in this case, the art.
Yeah,
One of
that's a good
the
point because I'll tell you something, Chandra, that we fought to have the artists' names on the cover.
Oh,
I
really?
think that's super important in a graphic novel. This is such a collaborative effort, and
Mm.
it's going to be perceived. I mean, I think this is so well. This is a pretty well drawn graphic novel, so much so that I think that they should have first billing, right? Like we are just. I think most comic books. Tell me if I'm wrong, Jimmy. Is the writer the first billing or is the artist? I don't even know. It could be
It probably
depends.
depends. I mean, it might be typical writer and artist, but if the artist is super well known or vice
Sure.
versa, you probably have
So
some exceptions. But I want to make sure we're giving some shout out and also not taking credit where that belongs to someone else. The art really was very important to getting the story across.
yeah, our publisher was the one who made a decision on whose names go on the top. And so on the inside cover, you have the artist names. I think it probably could have been reversed because the reality of it is that Jimmy's absolutely right. It's so interesting that the screenwriter controls some of this stuff in a movie, but you have a separate director, you have a separate set designer, you have a separate costumer, you have a separate, all these people are involved in the overall look of the movie. Probably more importantly than just I mean, as importantly as the screenplay for sure. So we don't get control over it. We did have control in the sense that we could say, no, he shouldn't look like that. Give me a couple more options that maybe, and we would make suggestions about how he should look, you know. So we would get some of those things. But to be honest, it is all art. This is an artistic venture. Yes, there's great, I think, great apologetics content in here. I think this is the kind of book, honestly, you could give somebody and you provoke a conversation. As a matter of fact, before I get too much further, let me say this. We are very sensitive to the idea that we're selling something here. I don't like it. This is the nature of writing books. At some point, somebody who's helping you get this out to people, they have a profit margin.
Right.
We don't actually need it. We have jobs. You know, we're not full-time ministers. We're not full-time apologists. We're in this profession called law enforcement. Now, we want to be able to make this book available, but we also want to offer so much free stuff with it that it feels like it's a small cost. So for this book, we think that this is the kind of book that's going to provoke a conversation. So when you buy the book on our website, there's a digital download for like a conversation starter. Like what are the issues in the book? How are you going to navigate those conversations? How can you use this book? Because I've been saying this a lot lately, really since I started serving with Billy Graham Association. There's no power in this book. There's no power in the case for Christianity. The power is in the gospel. It's as simple as that. We
Mm-hmm.
want books that make the gospel accessible because that's where the power is. I think this book is one of those books that'll to make the gospel accessible, that people will start thinking about it and maybe have a less prideful kind of objection to the gospel. Well, hear it. I didn't hear it for years because I was too full of myself to hear the gospel clearly. Something I needed to kind of investigate my pride away, you know, my idea that I had the answers. So a lot of this is what this kind of book does.
Yeah, you always give away stuff with your books, but I went on the website for case files and I'm like, oh my goodness, it's a lot, like the things that people get when they buy the book. Now, I don't know how long that's available for, or if it's just like get the book and you get it.
Well, and now we're going to make that available for the life of the book. I mean, part of
Okay.
it is that I mean, that's true for all of our books. You'll see there's a
Hmm.
robust. Now, there's not a PowerPoint for this because you're not going to teach this book.
Right.
And a lot of our other books that people end up teaching them. So we want to provide the PowerPoint so they can teach it. So that's great. But this is different. You know, we're not. This is really an interesting world for us. Is that we're not writing nonfiction here. We're writing fiction,
Yeah.
and you and I are in the world of nonfiction.
Yeah. Hmm.
So it's like we're not even sure what we're doing here in the sense that I think it came out really good. I'm
Yes.
just going to say that not because it's just not me. It's mostly the artist that made it work.
It's great. Yeah.
But the reality of it is that I don't. This is a weird space to be in, but I do think you could leverage a fiction book to get you thinking deeply about reality, a nonfiction idea.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like again, that leads us to, when Jesus spoke in parables. I mean, it's a strategy, it's a technique because the ultimate goal is to get somebody to the truth. You're leading them to the truth. Whether you do that through fiction or nonfiction, I don't think that it matters. I think you're looking at, I always think as a teacher, what's my students, learning style? What's the best way to get them from point A to point Z or however many points it takes to get to the final
Right.
concept, learning. And I don't really care what medium I use. I just want them to learn the thing that they need to learn. And Jesus, he used parables because he wanted his audience to get to the truth, and he laid it out for them in storytelling. And you guys are using this with case files. I think that, you know, much of the apologetics books, like a lot of the apologetics books out there, uh, they don't use obviously storytelling. And so you have to get your brain like really focusing in and honing in on whatever it is we're trying to communicate. Why do you think storytelling, like you're going down this route, which it takes, which again, to me, it's really cool that your son's coming up with a different way of speaking the apologetics to people, but using you to do that, you're doing it together. Why do you think storytelling is an effective way to teach truth to others?
Well, I'll go first on this one, only because I think that what's happening is that we are shifting. For me as a boomer, I needed to know, is it true? Just that's just how I think. I think
Mhm.
that I was raised in a generation that probably thought that way. But I think that the challenges that culture presents right now, I think the bigger question is not, is Christianity true? It's, is it good? But probably even more subtly, is it beautiful?
Mhm.
Because there's a sense in which no one wants to talk about truth anymore. They really want to talk about beauty. So I think that's where we have to shift our way of thinking. And my books have changed. I mean, I started off with Cold Case Christianity and God's Crime Scene and Forensic Faith. Those are books about the data. Here's the evidence. Here's the most reasonable inference from evidence. But Person of Interest and Truth and True Crime are books about the beauty of Christianity, because I do think in the end that's going to become well. And look, here's the other thing. I'm not a Christian apologist. I'm just a guy who came to faith through apologetics. I
Mhm.
can tell you how that happened. If it's good for you, great. If it helps you, great. But I'm not looking to start another career. As a matter of fact, Jimmy's having kids. And now that he's having kids, I'm the grandfather. I'm the opa. And let me tell you something. There is nothing more fun. This is the best time of life. And
Mhm.
so I'm going to be shrinking from the scene because I'm growing hopefully as a grandparent. And that's been so much fun for me. So there's a season in which you do this. Now for
Mhm.
Jimmy, he's coming in on the beauty side of it. I think that's more appropriate for the generation in which he lives.
Mhm.
Because I think that's, now, am I wrong, Jim? I think that's part of it. I mean, I know you want the truth part of it too, but I think we have to make a case in this generation for the beauty of Christianity.
I do think, aside from, I mean, it wasn't a primary motivator in terms of why I wanted to do the graphic novel beauty, but I do think that there is a kind of growing conversation surrounding, is Christianity beautiful? And where does that kind of, how does that kind of drive our relationship and our faith, our daily walk with God? But for me, I'll just speak to my own personal experience. From the time I'm like around 8 years old, I was a Christian. I'm reading the Bible and I'm learning moral values from my faith, from the Bible, from going to church, from my Christian community. But I would say probably equally, if not more important to my moral development, was comic books. I would say that a lot of my ideas as a kid about what was right and wrong came from Spider-Man and the X-Men.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, whether that is right or wrong, that's where I was getting a lot of my ideas. And I was always captivated by Stan Lee's Spider-Man, that he was this guy who he would always, finally, when things were going right, he finally got the girl to agree to go on the date with him. On the way to the date, yeah, Dr. Octopus robs a bank and he's got to go fight him, which means he missed the date, and the girl thinks that he's a loser and doesn't like her, and his whole personal life is falling apart, but he still has to make the decision to go do the right thing
Mhm.
and fight the bad guy, even though it's going to cost him personally. And I was always really captivated by this idea that doing the right thing involved great self-sacrifice. And so that was really, like, I mean, to this day, that is still in the back of my mind, that this is a basic moral principle, that I need to be self-sacrificial. I'm not saying I didn't get it through my faith, but I would say it was probably more impressed upon me through Spider-Man than it was through anything else in my life.
Mhm.
Maybe I'm overstating it. I had a lot of self-sacrificial people in my life that maybe I just um, didn't, I took for granted how much they were teaching me. But I can just tell you from my own life, I know that stories have taught me a lot about life. Now, the problem, well, the good thing about the old days when I was a kid was most of those comic books did not have anything that was, they might not have been Christian per se, but there was nothing objectionable or that would have been contrary in Stan Lee's Spider-Man to my Christian faith. But today, there's few comic books out there that I could point to that wouldn't have something that would probably be objectionable to a Christian, or at least you kind of have to hold your nose to, or just understand intellectually, hey, I can't give my whole heart to this. And I love crime stories. My favorite crime series in comics is anything by these two guys, Brubaker and Phillips. I buy everything that they do, but all their content is like rated R, or got some stuff that you would not, as a Christian, be able to give your whole heart to. And I wanted to, if we're going to get the opportunity to create a graphic novel, is to create something that a Christian could read and go, man, I can actually fully give myself over to this story. This is edifying. This encourages me. I love to think this is an apologetic tool, but in some ways, I just wanted something that would encourage me as a Christian. As a Christian, I would love to have a bunch more Christian comics that just um, encouraged me in my daily walk, and that I could just read and go, yeah, I'm all in on this. And so that was sort of kind of where I came from in terms of what I wanted to do with the story, or why I would want to use story to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's so important, Chandra, too, because let me tell you, you're right, Jimmy, is that we're where the writers were back, and when those classic early comic books probably reflected a more generally well-known and embraced Christian worldview in the culture anyway. And this is why it's so important for us to produce fictional works that are beautiful and actually stand on a Christian worldview, because look how much more influence these things have on young people. They do. I mean, we could talk about Christianity. I don't think anyone's been more. I don't know anybody on planet Earth who is more interested in his Christian worldview than Jimmy. I know where he's spending his discretionary income, and where he's spending his discretionary time in terms of podcasts, what he's listening to. Like, I know what he's doing. But that commitment to Christian worldview, and still he would say that what had bigger influence on his way of thinking about morality were fiction. Why is that the case? Well, it's because there's something relational about fiction. Like, you can resonate with the why do you think the Gospels are such a vehicle for we fall in love with Jesus, because the story of his life and ministry it's a narrative, and narrative, as opposed to, for example, like Proverbs. Here are some principles. Okay. No, it's the story of Jesus that captivates us. So I think we have to be, as Christians, in the business of storytelling, because it seems like that's very, very reasonable way to approach it. And this is exactly what God did in the Gospels, at least. If all you had, for example, no Gospels, but the teaching of Jesus is reflected in the letters, so you have the New Testament letters, but no Gospels, it would be a very different faith. It's
Absolutely.
the narrative stories of Jesus that help us to fall in love with him. And then we're grateful for him. We want to serve him. We understand the principles because the story is so vivid. This is why The Chosen, by the way, I think has such an impact on culture, Christian culture too, because now you're taking what are narratives, the Gospels, but you're really blowing them out as narrative storytelling with all the richness of relationships. You're making these things up, of course, but the point is that storytelling is very compelling. So I think that Jimmy's in a perfect position right now, and this is why this is, we hope, the first of many efforts. Here's the problem with doing graphic novels. I think it's a bit of a moving target, because the artistic world it flips over so often. Like, it's hard to hold an artistic team together long enough to even do one graphic novel, let alone a series of them. So we are writing the next one. And we're going through that process right now of, okay, here's an overarching idea. How do you want to change it? Let's get, and then in the end, Jimmy will just power through it, and it'll end up being I think it'll be I don't know about you, Jimmy, but I'm actually feeling even better about our story trajectory for the second one than we did in the first one. So I think, we have some ideas, but I think now is the time for all of us as Christians to start to tell stories. So if you're interested if you think, well, yeah, I don't have this apologetic skill set, but you don't have to be overly ambitious. This is not an overly ambitious book from an apologetics perspective. It is definitely ambitious from a storytelling perspective, though.
Yeah.
And that's why what I think happens in Christian, you tell me if I'm wrong. I think sometimes Christian fiction rather tries to be overly ambitious in both areas. And when you try to be overly ambitious in sharing the gospel, you have a tendency to be a little bit off-putting with it occasionally. So
Yeah.
this is a book that I hope, and we'll see where this goes, but I think it's a book that hopefully is not off-putting. If you're somebody who's like, I don't really care about Christianity, you might by the time you get done with this. That's the goal.
At
Well,
least there's a question that you have to answer, if whether you're a Christian or not, related to this question of value. If you think all people are equal, we all have the same amount of value. The question would be why? Why do you think that? Can you actually ground that in something? But even on the flip side, if you said no, not everyone is equal, there's some people who are more important or more valuable. you still got to go, okay, but where are you grounding that?
Hmm.
Why would, by what basis would you say someone is actually more valuable than another? So regardless of where you even think on this topic, there is a question everyone essentially needs to answer. And so I hope that at least you read the story and it makes you think, yeah, what would I really say? What could I really point to that would actually give someone true value?
Hmm. I like the idea too. I don't like fake, and I don't like overtly, like you said, this is a mess. It's messy. It talks about the realness of life. And I appreciate those things, and I think a lot of people do. I don't think people like the stuffy, either like you said, overtly in your face or the too glossy, shiny Christianity. Like you're gonna live life to its fullest if you give your heart to Jesus. And it's like, you're still living in this fallen world. What does that look like? We still have to answer all these questions, and we still have to look at the claims of the culture and then our claims as Christians and say, do we know how to have these conversations with other people? And can we, I think of when you teach your kids something, or even if you're learning it yourself, but then you see the reinforcement of a book like this.
Mhm.
And like you're saying, Jimmy, I was looking at comic books and I can really see that good and that evil, that war inside your own heart for choosing to do the right thing, and then the war outside of yourself to have to go choose, seeing what's going on in the world and saying this is good and this is evil. That's just reinforcing that whole, the whole good versus evil in the Bible, and so I look at this as obviously they supplement those concepts. They help supplement and reinforce those things in a way that is so creative. And if you can get somebody interested in it, they're going to learn. If you could, when I always say, if my students are asking questions or they're talking and they don't want to let the Zoom go, and they don't want to get off, I have to take that as a great sign that they're learning and that they're invested in this because they're interested in it. So I think storytelling, I'm always like Jim, when you wrote your last book, and you had all like the cop stories at the beginning, like you're starting, I'm like, okay, what's going to happen next? And then you'd cut in and you'd start giving, and then you'd come back to it. Like I could not wait to see how this was going to go. Like what these, if they're going to find the person who killed the woman or what, I just, you're going to, you reel them in and then they're learning. And sometimes people don't even realize they're learning with the story.
You
So,
know what's interesting about that too is that I feel that way too about, and I always thought someday I'm going to write fiction. I've been talking to Jimmy about this forever, and someday I'm going to write fiction. What I realized is that this is it for me. This involvement with Jimmy and these fictional books is it, because I think that Jimmy's a better storyteller, and I'm just watching him. I love the idea of sketching overarching narratives, but I also realize there's a certain giftedness in doing fiction.
yeah.
It's an art. I mean, it's not something you just bump. Oh, I can write a fiction book. Not really.
Mm-mm.
This is something you have to learn to do, and it takes time. And because I think, here's why I think he's a better storyteller. All those boxes behind him
Yeah.
are what make you. And Stephen King, on his book On Writing, which is a
Mhm.
great book about writing fiction, he talks about how he spends as much time each day reading as he does reading other people's fictional books as he does writing his own. His
Mm.
mornings are reserved for writing, his
Yeah.
afternoons are reserved for reading. So he's in the effort of reading more fiction. And I think you and I, if you're like me anyway, I read a lot more nonfiction
Yeah, I
because I'm
do.
researching, collecting data, making a case, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Well, it's all of the time that he spent reading fiction that makes him a better fiction writer.
Hmm.
So I get to play in this a little bit and watch this. And you know how that, as a parent, you know how this is that nothing gives you greater joy than your own kids and seeing them
Yeah.
blossom in a certain area. That is just true.
Yeah.
Like that, you might be competitive with the world, but you see your own kids and you're like, I'll just get out of the way, because you're not competitive with your kids. You're like just in love with your kids.
Right. Right.
So there's a part of me that's like, yeah, I'm enjoying this process with him because I can contribute something, hopefully. But in the end, I trust him to write the narrative. I don't have to fact check. I don't have to like look over his shoulder. So I do think this is where storytelling needs to advance for us as apologists. Take a risk.
Hmm.
If you read a lot of fiction, dabble in it, short story it.
Yeah.
Blogs are a good place to practice your writing and do short stories. I think in the end, we're going to need a generation of fiction writers who are writing it from an apologetics perspective to at least reach the people that aren't reached by apologetics books. That's a very small niche audience that doesn't
Mhm.
sell a lot, doesn't read a lot of books. They're committed, but they're few. Even in the church, the number of people who are committed to reading apologetics books
Right.
is pretty small, but people will read fiction. So if you're interested in apologetics and you're listening to this, because a lot of our audiences are people who like to do what we like to do, dabble in it. Start writing some short stories. You might find yourself being able to reach people.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced that I'm a good writer at all, but I hope you'll read the book and enjoy it in spite of me. And I do think that stories, when I read a nonfiction apologetics book, I'm very fed intellectually. I love it. But I think when I read a fictional story, I'm in it. I'm in that world
Mhm.
for a little while. And so I think if we can create a way for people to be in their faith in that same way, where you're in
Mhm.
it, you're not simply thinking of it. Although I love the intellectual side probably more than anything else. I think if we can put ourselves in it, in our faith a little bit, I think that helps us stay a little more grounded and makes it feel more real to us.
That's good. I like that. I get that because you're right. When I read fiction, rarely, you're right, Jim. I need to. They say if you want to be a better, like a more colorful writer, read fiction. I'm like, when do I have the time to do that? But I need to borrow some of Jimmy's boxes back there and
Hey,
start.
comics are good. I'm a slow reader, but you can get through 20 pages okay in one sitting.
Yeah,
Why
yeah,
is that?
that's
Because
good.
it has like 100 words
Yeah.
and a lot of
Yes,
pictures.
but I read, I read slow, so I wouldn't say I'm like a voracious reader reading a book a week or anything like that, but I do love to read.
But I love that when you read the fiction, you're in it. And this is going to be that makes sense to me. That's really good. When you think of case files and people opening up and reading it, who's the reader you envision or readers? What types of readers you think it's good for?
I think, look, when I read it, I'm thinking, when I'm writing it and charting it, I am not thinking of my audience is always the same genre. It's probably your audience. It's junior hires and high schoolers. I think that's the
Mm.
most. Now look, when we're writing to that level, when we're writing it so I can throw the ball in a way that people in I have high expectations for high schoolers. I think I can raise the bar pretty high. And I've always tried to do that with my high
Mhm.
schoolers. Jimmy will
Yeah.
tell you that I was teaching those principles that are in cold case Christianity years before I wrote the book to high schoolers. That's how that book came about. It was just my teaching to high schoolers. So it's a book that I think that high schoolers can easily embrace. It's visual.
Hmm.
I think that's kind of what we're doing here. Do I think that adults are going to like this book? I do. I have already seen the response I'm getting from people who have previewed it. So I think that's great. But the reality of it is, we need to target young people, Gen Z and millennials. We need to make that our focus because that's the future of the church. If
Yeah.
you're my age and you're in, you're in. You don't probably need a lot more convincing. If you're in your 60s and you're a believer, I think you're probably going to make it. You're
Yeah.
probably going to stay in that position. But if you're in your 20s and 30s and you're still examining this in context of all the other worldviews that are available to you, and even more importantly, you're examining it in the context of the distractions that come through the glowing rectangle, I think it's time for us to be able to address that generation. So, yes, I'm looking at people who are young and young at heart.
Mm-hmm.
That spans a broad age.
Hmm.
But if I had to make a choice between which group I want to read it, give me the young,
Yeah.
because it turns out that's the group that's going to be most challenged. I don't know how you feel about that, Jimmy.
For me, there was just three loves that I was able to put into this comic: a love of comics,
Mhm.
a love of law enforcement, and a love of my faith. So if you
Mhm.
love one of those three things or a combination, try out the book.
That's good. Yeah. I like that. So you guys did mention that another one's in the works. Anything that we should know about that one coming up? Anything we can know right now without giving the whole thing away?
We
Well,
are we're deep in writing it and reworking some of of our thoughts. We've been playing around with this for a long time, ever since we finished the script for this first one, which was actually going back a couple of years. I don't know if we can tease too much, but there's a couple characters that make brief appearances in volume one that are going to take more of a center role, I think, in the next story. And I think our goal here is to create two books that could be read on their own, maybe out of order, but ultimately do continue the story. So if you like some of the characters from volume one, you'll see them again,
Mm.
and catch us this time around, because you don't want to be late coming in volume two, but
Yeah.
there will be a volume two hopefully before too long.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
and I think what we're trying to do is look at two completely different issues. So think of
Mm.
all the things you could write about. If you look at your apologetics course for junior hires, it's robust and there's like a ton of lessons in there. Well, if each lesson could be a book, that's what we're trying to look at. So
Mm.
there's some things we can talk about related. I just thinking going forward in law enforcement, one of the things that was so powerful for me were issues about how we ground moral truths. What makes something right or wrong to enforce? How do I deal with the problem of evil? How do I answer a victim family who's lost their 10-year-old? How do I, how do I answer some of these bigger questions? Well, that's one of those are the things that law enforcement officers have to address all the time. So there's lots of space here for us to examine these issues. And I think that hopefully this is just another way in. If you're somebody who's interested in apologetics, yeah, you want all of your consumption of media to kind of glow in the heavy spotlight of a Christian worldview. Well, then we have to start producing fiction that'll help you do that.
Yeah. Where can we find this book? It's available right now, right?
Yeah, it's available for pre-order, but by the time we actually probably post, it'll be we're really close to the ordering on this. So what we did is we have everything's on our website, and that's where you can get all the free stuff.
Mm.
Is through our, of course, it's available on every platform. But if you just go to casefilesgraphicnovel.com, casefilesgraphicnovel.com, that'll always be the landing page for the book. And right now, of course, it's at the top banner at coldcasechristianity.com also. But again, I always say if you like you and I, we offer a lot of free stuff to people who are gonna, like this video, like just like what content.
Hmm.
Yeah, I get it. You should probably examine all the free content you can from an author before you end up deep diving. So we want to have a robust package that's available at our website for free if you buy the book.
Mm. That's good. Well, I'm excited about it. I'm going to be telling my students that are in my worldview class to go check it out and all their families. Thank you both so much for being on the show again. It's always a pleasure to have a Wallace on. To have two is double the fun. So I appreciate you both being here.
Hey, thanks so much for having us. We'll do it anytime, Chandra. I so appreciate your work and I want to advance your cause too. So this anything we can do for you, just let us know.
Thank you so much. All right, guys, you heard it. You can go to casefiles.com to find all the information. I'll make sure I link that in the show notes in case I just butchered that website. But you guys don't want to miss out on the pre-order and getting all the free stuff. So I would go there to check it out first. And you won't go wrong with this book. If you have a younger audience, or if you work with youth, if you work with, middle schoolers on up, even if you're working with Christians who aren't well versed in some of the things like apologetics, this is going to be a great resource. And I highly recommend anything from a Wallace, then, it's going to be good. So check out all the information there in the show notes. If you have any questions for me, you can email me at hello@shandafulbright.com, and I'll catch you on the next one.